I still remember the exact moment I realized my life could be taken over without a single warning, and it started with a gate that did not belong to anyone on my side of the property line. My name is Ethan Carter, and I have lived in this house outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, for over 12 years, paying every tax, maintaining every inch of land, and respecting every boundary I was legally required to respect. That morning began like any other, with a quiet cup of coffee in my kitchen and the familiar sight of sunrise over the trees, until I stepped outside and saw something that made me stop cold in my tracks. A large iron gate had been installed overnight at the end of my driveway, cutting off the only practical exit I had to the main road, and there was no notice, no explanation, just a cold metal barrier where open access used to be. I remember standing there for a moment, trying to convince myself it had to be a mistake, maybe a construction error, maybe something temporary, but deep down I already knew this was intentional. A black SUV pulled up slowly behind the gate, and that was when I saw her, Victoria Langford, stepping out with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from someone who believes rules apply differently to them. She didn't greet me, didn't hesitate. She simply looked at the gate and then at me, as if I were the one out of place on my own property. "This section is now private access only," she said, holding a clipboard like it was a symbol of authority rather than just paper and ink. I asked her what she meant, explaining as calmly as I could that this driveway had been my legal access point since I bought the home, and that there had never been any restriction on it in any recorded survey or deed. She didn't raise her voice, but her answer carried something far heavier than anger, a certainty that she believed she had already won. Victoria told me that updated property agreements had been approved through what she called a community management revision, and that all residents were expected to comply immediately. I asked to see those documents, and she simply tapped the clipboard, saying they were filed and binding, as if that alone settled the matter. What struck me most was not just what she said, but how quickly she expected me to accept it, as though my years of living here could be overwritten by a single morning of paperwork I had never seen. I told her I needed to verify this with the county records office, and for the first time her expression shifted slightly, not in doubt, but in impatience, like I was slowing down something already decided. As she returned to her vehicle, she added one final sentence without looking back, saying that enforcement would be necessary if I refused cooperation. The gate stood between me and the road, silent and unmoving. But in that moment, it felt like more than metal. It felt like a line had been drawn not just across my driveway, but across everything I thought I could trust about ownership, law, and fairness. And I had no idea yet how quickly that line would begin pulling other people into this conflict. I stood there for several minutes after Victoria Langford drove away, staring at the iron gate as if it might suddenly explain itself. But the only thing it offered was silence and the uncomfortable reality that my access to the outside world had been reduced to a single lock point controlled by someone else. I walked back into my house, placed my coffee on the counter, and tried to approach the situation logically. Because panic never solves anything, but every logical thought kept circling back to the same question of how a structure like that could appear overnight without permits, notice, or any form of communication from the county or a recognized authority. I pulled out my laptop and began searching public property records for Cedar Ridge County, scrolling through easements, right-of-way maps, and historical surveys that confirmed what I already knew, that my driveway access had been recorded as a legal easement since the original subdivision plan was approved decades ago. The more I read, the more certain I became that nothing in official records supported what I had just seen outside my home, which only made the situation more confusing and more deliberate in appearance. Around mid-morning, I heard a vehicle approaching again, this time slower, followed by footsteps near the gate, and when I stepped outside, I saw two neighbors standing at a distance, looking toward my property with uncertainty rather than support. One of them, a man named Harold Benson, who had lived 2 streets over for years, called out that there were rumors spreading in the neighborhood group chat about a new private access agreement that supposedly affected multiple properties in this area. I asked him if anyone had verified it with the county, and he hesitated before saying that most people assumed it was already legally handled because it came from what was described as a community management update. That phrase hit me again with the same weight Victoria had used, as if repeating it enough times could replace actual legal confirmation. As I was speaking with Harold, I noticed a second vehicle arrive at the end of the road, and from it stepped a security guard wearing a dark uniform, carrying a small handheld device, who began inspecting the gate without acknowledging me at first. When I asked who had authorized him to be there, he responded that he was assigned to enforce temporary access restrictions under private instruction, though he could not provide any official county documentation when I requested it. The situation was becoming clearer in one unsettling way, not because I understood it, but because it was starting to function like a coordinated effort rather than a misunderstanding. I returned to my house and called the county recorder office directly, wading through a long automated system before finally speaking to a clerk who confirmed that no changes had been filed regarding my property access or driveway easement. That confirmation should have brought relief, but instead it raised a deeper concern, because if nothing had changed legally, then everything happening outside my home was operating outside that framework entirely. I sat at my desk for a long moment, listening to the sound of distant footsteps outside and watching the gate through my window like it had become a boundary between two versions of reality, one documented and one being imposed in real time without approval. And I realized that this situation was no longer just about access to a road. It was about whether the truth recorded on paper would be enough to stand against what was being physically enforced at my doorstep. I thought the situation could not escalate further until the neighborhood stopped feeling like a community and started feeling like an observation zone around my own property. Because by early afternoon, there were more cars slowing down near my driveway than I had ever noticed in a single day, and each one seemed to reduce speed just enough to look without fully stopping. I stayed inside for a while, watching through the window, trying to maintain focus on the facts I had already confirmed that my legal access had not been altered in any official system. Yet outside my home, a completely different version of reality was being enforced as if paperwork no longer mattered. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I saw Victoria Langford return, this time with a second vehicle behind her. And she did not come alone, because several individuals in matching uniforms stepped out and began positioning temporary signs along the edge of the road, as if they were establishing a control perimeter. I went outside immediately and asked what authority they were operating under, and Victoria responded without hesitation that the community had approved a transitional access structure pending administrative updates, a phrase that sounded official but contained no verifiable detail. I asked her again for documentation that could be verified at the county level, and she repeated the same motion with her clipboard, insisting that the approval was already processed through private management channels. At that point, I made a decision not to argue emotionally, because emotion was not producing answers, so I returned inside and began documenting everything I could see with timestamps, photographs, and written notes, including the exact placement of the gate, the signage, and the presence of personnel who could not produce public authorization. While I was recording this, I received a call from Harold Benson again, and his tone had changed from curiosity to concern because he told me that more. Residents were beginning to question the situation after noticing that the so-called new access policy did not appear in any official county announcements. He also mentioned that someone in the neighborhood association meeting had used the term emergency compliance update, which only added more confusion because no emergency declaration had been issued by any public authority. As I continued gathering information, I noticed something that made the situation even more unsettling, which was that the security personnel were not acting aggressively or confrontational, but instead operated with a calm confidence that suggested they believed their instructions were valid, regardless of external verification. That detail mattered because it indicated this was not a random act of trespass or misunderstanding, but a structured process relying on persuasion and perceived legitimacy rather than force. By late afternoon, I contacted the county sheriff office for the first time, explaining the situation as clearly as possible, including the presence of a newly installed gate blocking a recorded easement and the use of private enforcement personnel claiming administrative authority. The dispatcher informed me that a deputy would be assigned to review the matter, but there was no estimated arrival time due to current field priorities, which left me once again in a state of waiting while the situation outside my home continued to evolve without pause. As the sun began to lower slightly in the sky, I noticed Victoria speaking with one of the uniformed personnel near the gate, pointing toward my house briefly before they both looked in my direction, and in that moment I realized the conflict had shifted beyond confusion or misunderstanding, because now I was no longer just dealing with a disputed claim. I was dealing with a system of enforcement that was acting as if its version of authority would eventually replace the official record entirely. I was still reviewing my notes from the afternoon when I noticed a shift outside that felt different from everything that had happened earlier, because the activity near the gate slowed down and became more structured, as if someone important had arrived and the entire situation was being brought under review. A few minutes later, a marked vehicle pulled up at the end of the driveway, and Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped out, observing the scene without immediate comment, taking in the gate, the signage, the personnel, and the positions they had established around my property. I met him at the edge of my driveway and explained everything from the beginning, including the lack of county approval, the recorded easement, and the confirmation I had already received from the recorder office that no changes had been filed. He listened without interruption, which in itself felt significant, because until that moment, every conversation I had experienced had involved someone trying to assert authority rather than evaluate facts. Behind him, Victoria Langford approached, holding her clipboard again, and for the first time I noticed that her confidence had shifted slightly, not disappearing, but becoming more controlled, as if she was preparing to justify everything rather than simply state it. The sheriff asked both of us to provide documentation, and Victoria immediately presented her papers, explaining that the community management had authorized a transitional access revision pending formal registration. The sheriff reviewed the documents carefully, then asked a direct question about county filing confirmation, and there was a brief pause before she responded that the filings were in process through private administration channels. That phrase created a visible change in the sheriff's expression, not of judgment, but of clarification, as if he had just identified a gap between private procedure and public law. He then asked me to show my records, and I provided everything I had, including property maps, easement documentation, and the confirmation from the county office that no modification had been recorded. At that point, the sheriff requested additional verification from his radio unit, stepping slightly away to make a direct call to the county records department while the rest of us waited in silence. During that time, I observed the uniformed personnel who had been assisting Victoria earlier, and they were no longer moving forward with any adjustments, instead standing by as if awaiting instruction that no longer felt certain. When the sheriff returned, his tone remained steady but noticeably firmer, and he confirmed that the county had no record of any approved access change affecting my property. That single statement shifted the entire atmosphere, because it established a clear separation between what had been claimed and what was officially recognized. Victoria attempted to explain again, referencing internal community approval processes, but the sheriff interrupted politely and clarified that any modification affecting recorded easements must be filed and approved through county jurisdiction, regardless of private agreements. I could see the impact of those words on everyone present, because it reframed the entire situation from a disputed neighborhood matter into a matter of enforceable public record. The sheriff then instructed that no physical barriers could remain in place without legal authorization, and that the gate installation required immediate review for compliance. As he spoke, the surrounding activity slowed completely, and the earlier sense of coordinated certainty gave way to hesitation, as if the structure that had been built around my driveway was now being examined for its legitimacy rather than assumed to have it. Victoria stood quietly for a moment, looking at the gate she had presented with such confidence earlier in the day, and I realized that the balance of authority had begun to shift not through confrontation, but through the simple act of verifying what was real and what was not officially recognized. I noticed the change in atmosphere almost immediately after the sheriff confirmed the absence of any official county approval, because the confidence that had filled the space earlier in the day began to dissolve into small, uncertain movements around the gate, as if everyone involved was suddenly recalculating their position. The uniformed personnel who had been placing signs earlier stopped what they were doing and stood at a distance, no longer advancing or making adjustments, while Victoria Langford remained near the center of the driveway, holding her clipboard but no longer using it as a tool of authority, only as something to occupy her hands. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped slightly closer to the gate and began examining its installation more carefully, taking photographs and measurements while speaking into his radio to request confirmation from county compliance records, ensuring that every detail of the situation was documented in real time. I stayed nearby, listening as he explained that any obstruction affecting a recorded easement required explicit approval through county permitting channels and could not be enforced through private management decisions, regardless of internal agreements or community votes. Those words did not feel dramatic when he said them, but they carried weight because they were precise and grounded in procedure rather than interpretation. Victoria attempted to respond by referencing what she called transitional authorization, but the sheriff interrupted calmly and asked her to provide the specific county file number associated with that authorization. And for the first time, she did not answer immediately. There was a pause that lasted several seconds, long enough for the surrounding tension to become visible in the way people shifted their stance and avoided direct eye contact. The sheriff then confirmed over his radio that no such file existed in the county system, and that there was no active or pending approval related to my property access. That confirmation marked a clear turning point because it removed ambiguity from the situation and replaced it with a single verifiable fact that contradicted the entire basis of the gate's installation. The sheriff then instructed that the gate could not remain in place without proper authorization and requested that any non-compliant structures be scheduled for removal pending formal review. As he spoke, one of the uniformed personnel quietly stepped back toward their vehicle and another lowered the equipment they had been holding earlier, signaling a gradual withdrawal from active involvement. Victoria stood still for a moment, looking at the gate as if reassessing its meaning under new conditions. And I could see that her earlier certainty had shifted into something more cautious, not yet defeated, but no longer supported by the structure she had relied on throughout the day. I asked the sheriff what would happen next, and he explained that a formal report would be filed, documenting the unauthorized installation and the conflicting claims of authority, and that the matter would be escalated to county legal review if necessary. Hearing that made the situation feel more final than anything that had happened so far, because it was no longer about conversation or interpretation, but about an official record being created that would determine the outcome moving forward. As the sun began to lower further and the shadows around the driveway lengthened, the gate that had once felt like a fixed barrier now appeared temporary, not because it had physically changed, but because its legitimacy had been removed. And for the first time since the morning began, I understood that the balance of control in this situation was no longer defined by who acted first, but by which version of authority could actually be proven in the record that governed it. I remained near my driveway as the situation continued to settle into a new and quieter phase, where the earlier sense of control had been replaced by procedural observation and documentation, and every action being taken was now focused on verification rather than enforcement. Sheriff Daniel Brooks moved methodically around the gate, recording angles, speaking briefly into his radio, and taking notes that would later become part of the official report, while the remaining personnel who had arrived earlier stayed at a distance, no longer interacting with the structure or attempting any further modifications. Victoria Langford stood slightly apart from the center of activity, no longer issuing instructions, and I could see her reviewing her own documents repeatedly, as if searching for something that might still support her position under formal scrutiny. The sheriff requested that all parties remain on site until preliminary documentation was completed, and that any further claims regarding authorization or community approval be directed through official county channels rather than private coordination systems. As this process continued, I noticed several neighbors gathering at a safer distance along the road, observing silently without intervening, their earlier uncertainty now shifting into quiet attention as they realized the situation was being handled through formal legal procedure rather than neighborhood discussion. Harold Benson arrived again and stood beside me briefly, asking in a low voice whether this meant the gate would be removed, and I told him that nothing had been decided beyond verification of facts, but the direction of events had clearly changed. A short time later, the sheriff received additional confirmation over his radio that no emergency or temporary authorization had been filed at any level of county administration, and he acknowledged this information by noting it directly into his report. That moment added another layer of clarity, because it removed the final remaining ambiguity about whether any part of the installation had been recognized by public authority at any stage. Victoria attempted once more to explain that the process had been initiated through internal governance channels, but her voice carried less certainty than before, and the sheriff responded by reiterating that private governance structures could not override recorded property access rights without formal filing and approval. As the evening light continued to fade, the physical presence of the gate remained unchanged, but its function within the situation had shifted entirely, because it was no longer being treated as an accepted barrier, but as an object under review pending removal or correction based on official findings. The sheriff then informed me that I would receive a copy of the preliminary report once it was completed, and that any further action would proceed through county enforcement procedures if necessary. Hearing that, I realized the situation had fully transitioned from a confrontation at my property into a documented legal case, where every claim, every document, and every action taken that day would be evaluated against public records rather than private assertions. Victoria stood quietly for a long moment after that, looking toward the gate and then toward the road beyond it, and I could see that the structure she had relied on throughout the day was no longer supported by the certainty she had arrived with, but instead was being redefined in real time by the absence of official recognition. As the sheriff finished his final notes and prepared to leave for his next assignment, the atmosphere around my driveway had changed completely from one of imposed control to one of formal oversight, and I understood that what had begun as an unexpected obstruction had now become a matter that would be resolved not through presence or pressure, but through the recorded authority of law and verification. I expected the situation to end quietly after the sheriff left, but instead the hours that followed revealed that the real impact of that visit was not immediate removal of the gate, but a formal shift in how every action taken that day would now be reviewed, documented, and potentially reversed under county authority. By early evening, the uniformed personnel who had been stationed near my driveway had fully withdrawn, leaving only the gate in place and the paperwork trail that was now being assembled behind it, and Victoria Langford remained on site longer than I expected, standing near her vehicle while making several phone calls that I could not hear, but could tell were increasingly focused and less confident than earlier in the day. I stayed inside for a while, reviewing everything I had collected, organizing photographs, timestamps, and notes into a single file so that there would be no confusion about the sequence of events, because I understood that clarity of record was now the most important factor in determining what would happen next. Around that time, Harold Benson called again and told me that more neighbors had begun discussing the situation in detail, not from rumor anymore, but from what they had directly witnessed, including the sheriff's statements and the confirmation that no county authorization existed for the gate installation. He said the tone in the neighborhood had changed significantly, shifting from uncertainty to concern about how something like this could have progressed so far without proper verification. Later that evening, I noticed a county maintenance vehicle drive slowly past the entrance of the road, observing the gate without stopping, which reinforced the sense that the matter was no longer informal or localized, but now under broader administrative awareness. Victoria eventually left the area, and her departure felt noticeably different from her arrival earlier in the day, because there was no remaining display of authority or coordination, only a quiet exit that left the gate standing without anyone actively defending it. I stepped outside once the area was fully clear, and for the first time since the morning, I could see the driveway without people surrounding it, which made the structure itself feel less permanent and more like something awaiting a decision rather than enforcing one. A short time later, I received confirmation from the sheriff's office that a preliminary report had been officially filed and entered into county records, documenting the unauthorized installation, the conflicting claims of authority, and the requirement for further legal review before any structure affecting the recorded easement could remain in place. Reading that message made the situation feel final in a different way than I had experienced earlier, because it confirmed that the process had moved entirely into institutional handling rather than personal negotiation. As night began to settle over Cedar Ridge, I stood at the edge of my driveway and looked at the gate one more time, no longer as a barrier being actively enforced, but as an unresolved object now subject to official determination, and I realized that the conflict had fully transitioned from a confrontation at my property line into a recorded case that would be resolved not by presence or pressure, but by the steady process of verification, documentation, and legal authority that had already begun working in the background. I did not hear anything about the situation for most of the night, and that silence itself felt like a form of confirmation that everything had moved into a formal process. Beyond immediate visibility, where decisions were no longer being made on my driveway, but within county offices and legal review systems. The next morning began with an unexpected call from the sheriff's office, informing me that additional verification had been completed overnight and that the case file had been forwarded to the county legal department for expedited review due to the clear discrepancy between recorded easement rights and the physical obstruction that had been installed. I wrote down every detail carefully while listening, because I understood that every update now carried weight in determining how quickly the situation would be resolved. Later that morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed that the gate had not been removed, but something about it had changed in perception because there were no longer any signs, no personnel, and no vehicles associated with it, leaving it standing alone as an unclaimed structure under review rather than an active enforcement barrier. A short time later, Harold Benson arrived again and told me that the neighborhood discussion had shifted completely overnight because several residents had now contacted county offices directly after seeing the sheriff's confirmation report reference shared in community channels, and they were receiving the same information I had already been given, that no authorization existed for the installation. This created a noticeable change in the way people were responding, because uncertainty was being replaced by documentation and speculation was being replaced by verified records. Around midday, I received another update from the sheriff's office stating that a formal compliance review had been initiated and that the responsible parties would be required to provide justification through official channels if they intended to maintain any claim over access control affecting my property. That message made it clear that the burden of proof had fully shifted away from me and onto those who had initiated the restriction, and that every assertion would now need to be matched against public records rather than internal statements. In the afternoon, I saw Victoria Langford briefly return alone, without the earlier coordination or support structure, and she stood at a distance from the gate for several minutes without approaching my property, as if assessing the situation under new constraints. She did not attempt to speak with me, and instead made a short phone call before leaving again, which felt significantly different from her earlier presence, because there was no longer any attempt to assert control over the situation, only observation and withdrawal. As the day progressed, I received confirmation that county officials had scheduled a site inspection to physically document the gate and confirm its placement relative to recorded property boundaries, which marked the transition from administrative review to on-site verification. That evening, I stood once again at the edge of my driveway and looked at the gate under fading light, and I realized that what had once felt like an immediate obstruction had now become part of a documented legal process that was steadily moving forward without requiring any further action from me, because the system itself was now carrying the responsibility of determining what was valid and what could not legally remain in place. I received the final update early the next morning when the county inspection team arrived at my property, and for the first time since this situation began, everything that had previously been discussed, argued, or claimed was replaced by direct physical verification carried out by officials with clear authority and no connection to private statements. I stood at the edge of my driveway as they measured distances, photographed boundary markers, and cross-checked the placement of the gate against official survey data, while referencing county records that had already been confirmed earlier in the review process. Sheriff Daniel Brooks was present again to oversee the inspection, ensuring that every step was properly documented, and his presence reinforced that this was no longer an informal dispute, but a formal determination process based entirely on recorded evidence. Victoria Langford arrived shortly after the inspection began, but she did not approach the center of activity immediately, instead waiting at a distance while the team completed their initial measurements. And I could see that her earlier confidence had been replaced by a more restrained posture, as if she was now observing the situation rather than directing it. When she was eventually asked to provide any supporting documentation, she presented the same materials that had been shown earlier, but the inspection team confirmed within minutes that none of the documents matched any filed records in the county system. That moment was significant because it removed the final layer of ambiguity that had previously allowed competing interpretations to exist and replaced it with a single verified conclusion based on official data. The sheriff then confirmed